What's up, folks? So today I want to talk to you guys this morning about Muddy Waters and Thornton Dial, blues man Muddy Waters and abstract expressionist Thornton Dial, and talk about how their works were very similar. What they were communicating was very similar. Let's start off with kind of a Muddy Waters style riff, something that I'm kind of messing with. And while you guys are at it, of course, it's the morning. It's always good to start off with a good cup of coffee. So go to AmericanSoul.com and check out our grassroots coffee and American Soul collaboration, our sporting blend with, of course, my limited and very custom artwork on the front. One of my artistic styles. But if you look at the painting back here, this piece here for my son is very inspired also by Thornton Dial. So let's start off with some Muddy Water stuff. You guys know this as a very, very, very iconic but very basic blues shuffle. So that is something that I kind of like to mess around with and practice with all the time. And at the same time, a lot of my work, a lot of my assemblage work comes from the inspiration of Thornton Dial. So I think now more than ever in today's times, both artists are very relevant. When I start to see the resurgence of like folk music and stuff like that nowadays with various artists, I think back like, where did all of this come from? Because everything is derivative. And for me, myself, I look at Thornton Dial as someone that not only I very much so identify because he's from the South, from Bessemer, Alabama, but also I identify with his artistic style, but also what he was trying to communicate about the times. And at the same time, Muddy Waters was living at the same time, and were both doing the same type of thing and communicating it, although Muddy Waters was coming out of the Mississippi Delta and moved up to Chicago, and of course was one of the originators of the Chicago blues style. So, you know, in this, I also want to reference some works by Thornton Dial. One of them, notably, is one titled Don't Matter How Raggedy the Flag, It Still Got to Tie Us Together. And that was a very, very, very popular work. I think it's one of Thornton Dial's most iconic works. And at the same time, I want to pair that with I'm a Man and Can't Be Satisfied by Muddy Waters and kind of talk about those two on the back end, give a little bit of my thoughts and stuff on the back end of this episode. So first I want to talk about like how I got introduced to both of them. As far as Thornton Dial, I actually did not understand Thornton Dial's work when I very first got introduced to him through the Bill Lowe Gallery. So I was an installer there, and Bill had gotten connected to Bill Arnett, which I will reference Bill Arnett shortly. And Bill Arnett had access to Thornton Dial, was collecting his works and so on and so forth. And so Bill was bringing in works to the gallery, and I was just like, what in the world is this man's work? And you know, I would look through articles and stuff, and they were calling his work primitive. And like, I really don't like that thing about primitive artists and primitive artworks. I think it's almost a derogatory term in a lot of ways. and it tends to get associated with black artists a lot. But that's what was a thing, and we're talking about 2008, 2009 is when I got introduced to this. And so I had seen it come in, and I was really kind of bashing it. I'm not gonna lie. And Bill was like, "You might want to give it a chance." And so I think a little bit of time passed by. I can't remember how much time, but Bill was always, he was, like I said, Bill Lowe was very much so a mentor and a father figure for me. He ended up connecting me with the artist Michael David here. And Michael David was here in Atlanta at the time. He had a studio at King Plow Center. And he was like, go work under Michael David for a little bit. I'm thinking I'm about to come to Mr. David's studio and get to work. He's got these huge pieces. I'll put the links in the description and stuff for Michael David. But he's got these huge, three-dimensional sculptural pieces, and I'm just like, that's what I'm about to come in and do. He's using encaustic and all kinds of stuff. Well, I come in, Michael David is teaching a class, and I actually don't start painting. And he sits me down and he says, he looks through my portfolio, and he says, have you ever seen Thornton Dial? And I was like, yeah, I seen him, but I ain't really all that hot on him. From that point, it's funny what wisdom will do as an artist, but he sits me down for the entire day. I stayed there 6-8 hours, something like that, and puts a Thornton Dial book, the Soul's Grown Deep book, I think it was, but it was a comprehensive look at all of Thornton Dial's work throughout his lifetime, and was just like, learn this work, just learn it, sit down, don't do nothing else. By the time I got done with that, at the end of the day, I thought I would be disappointed because I was expecting something else, but what I gained was a completely different appreciation for the work of Thornton Dial and a new sense of relation to the work also. So that was kind of how I got introduced to Thornton Dial. One of the greatest accomplishments and achievements that I actually experienced in life while Bill Lowe was still alive was having my work at my wife and I's engagement party up next to Thornton Dial's work, up next to Jean-Michel Basquiat's work. That was really freaking cool to me. So.
You never told me that you sat for a whole day with him.
I didn't tell you that?
No, I remember bits and pieces of the story, but I didn't know you sat for an entire day and he made you read the book. That's really cool.
Yeah. So, that's Ashley in the background. She's painting right now. But yes, I thought I told you that story.
You told me that he introduced you and he impacted you, but I don't think I ever realized that he totally sensei'd you and was like, you were thinking you about to go in and paint. He's like, sit down, read.
Yeah, he just dropped yeah.
All the movies where it's like, I want to do it, and it's
he straight was like, no, pretty much, yeah. What was that, Karate Kid?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
You never told me that story, which is really cool.
Yeah, I was expecting something totally, and I think that's good. That's why I have an appreciation for our art history, because I've had a lot of really cool experiences like that. And when you're 19, 20 years old, you think you know everything about art, and no, you don't, right? So that was how I got introduced to Thornton Dial. And ever since, like I said, the greatest experience I had was at the engagement party. And it was my work, Dial's work on the wall, and Basquiat. And it was an early Basquiat, too. Jean-Michel Basquiat, again, was someone that I would think was influenced and impacted by Thornton Dial as well. And I'm going to talk about his influence on other artists, too, and another reason why him and Muddy Waters are similar. So, also, Muddy Waters, how I got introduced to him was, and I'm going to get to the history part. I like rambling and talking, and we here now. It's Durrell's art history class. So, I got introduced to Muddy Waters when I was working at Apple at Perimeter Mall here in Atlanta. And in the mornings, what Starbucks used to do, speaking of coffee, shout out to The Sporting Blend. Get your coffee, get your Sport and Blend. This is a short interruption commercial. So in the mornings before we would go into to our shift, it was a retail position. I was working in sales. Of course, I got to start off. It was a Starbucks right downstairs, and Starbucks used to do this thing where they would leave free downloads, these little cards on the counter.
Remember that?
Yeah, and I loved getting those cards. It was like a little musical treasure. Like every morning that I went in, it was something, or every week usually it was something different, and you could download it off of iTunes. And the song for that week was Muddy Waters' Champagne and Reefer. That's why I like that song so much. Um, Two fantastic things, but it was being something. I was like, Muddy Waters, Champagne and Reefer, like, what in the world? And I turned it on, and the subject matter obviously is cool, but the way that he just ripped that song, like, and it was his, it's original. And I had never heard blues like that. Like, you black, you know what I'm saying? You grow up hearing blues, but I didn't hear that type of blues. And that was shortly after college when I got back home and started working for Apple. So I have these like very real time memories with these artists, and I've been hooked on Muddy Waters ever since. Um, Actually, Muddy Waters, Jimi Hendrix was also inspired by Muddy Waters. Both of those guys were the two guys that actually peaked in Prince, again, inspired by Muddy Waters. I'm sorry, those three guys were the ones that inspired me to get into guitar. Um, so let's get into some historical stuff. So Muddy Waters, first of all, both Muddy Waters and Thornton Dial were born roughly at the same time. They lived at the same time. So Muddy Waters was born in 1915. Thornton Dial was born in 1928. So both of them also born in the abject poverty of the Jim Crow South, right? Muddy Waters coming from the Mississippi Delta, not too far to Clarksdale, but just Mississippi Delta, and Thornton Dial from Bessemer, Alabama. I've actually driven through Bessemer, Alabama. It is a very interesting.
Stop.
We did not stop. We stopped in Africa Town, which is its own really cool story. But no, I've driven through Bessemer. Bessemer is one of those magical places on the planet that I think, because of its circumstance, I feel like it looks now like it did not too long ago. Bessemer still has produced Thornton Dial, the G's Ben Quilt Makers, and so many other artists that have gone completely unseen and unknown, and that tends to be a common theme about artists and musicians in the South, particularly African American artists and musicians in the South, which leads me to my next point. So the way that both of these guys even gained prominence, it is how these things went and go, and I guess it was circumstantial for the time. But both of them were quote unquote, and I mean hard quotes, discovered by white men, right? They were doing their work. There was no sense of let me get famous off of it, which I really appreciate about going into making art. It's not about being famous. It's about making good work and making work that is raw and real and speaks to your interpretation of the times in life, whatever that may be. Well, Alan Lomax was working for the Library of Congress and documenting folk sounds and stuff like that, folk music and stuff like that in the South, and came across a Stovall plantation, and of course found Muddy Waters. You can find that story all online and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons why I actually like Martin guitars is because not the first guitar that Muddy Waters played, but the one that Alan Lomax gave Muddy Waters to play was a Martin, I think it was a 0018 acoustic guitar. I mean, he had what was then considered a portable recording studio in the back of his trunk. There's another black dude that was with him that was, I don't know if he was like traveling for, I don't really understand what his purpose was there, but anyway, he was there. He kind of hung out in the background. And so if you go to the, you can find the complete Plantation recordings on any streaming platform or YouTube or whatever from Muddy Waters. And those were the raw takes from Alan Lomax's trip down to the Mississippi Delta finding Muddy Waters. Initially, Muddy Waters thought that Alan Lomax was up to something because he was selling whiskey and bootlegging whiskey at the time, and he thought it was the government coming to get him, but it wasn't. So in that, you hear Muddy Waters talking about the circumstances in life, and the song Can't Be Satisfied. Well, I feel like snapping pistol in your face. Like, that song evolved from the complete Plantation recordings. Like the official version recorded by Chess Records in Chicago, that was an evolution of what came from Alan Lomax and that visit to Muddy Waters. And Muddy Waters was the man around town. Like, people, he played in jukes and stuff like that. Like, he was the guy to do that. The owner of the Stovall Plantation would call him to entertain his guests and stuff like that too. So he ended up having to, Alan Lomax actually produced the record for Muddy Waters. After a while, Muddy Waters didn't hear from him. He thought the dude took his music and left. And he sent him a record and a payment. And like, that's the start of commercial success for him. And then, of course, he's still in the Mississippi Delta at the time. He takes that record, keeps it with him. And then eventually he leaves and goes to Chicago. And then you start hearing the official versions of that. So that's, one thing. And then you look at an artist like Thornton Dial as a visual artist and painter. Honestly, he was doing the work of abstract expressionists before and during the time of the height of abstract expressionism, right? Like, he was right in that kind of golden age of abstract expressionism, or the heart of it, really. And again, he wasn't noticed until he was in his 60s or 70s. Like, and from what I've heard, personal accounts from Bill Lowe, when he would go, because, and I gotta tell the story of how Bill got there. But Bill would basically say that Thornton Dial had just a warehouse full of artworks. Like, he was just making stuff. There was no intent to sell anything. He was just making it for the sake of making it. But it was stuff all in his front yard. But anyway, Thornton Dial, later in his career, was found by a dude named Bill Arnett. Bill Arnett was actually from here in Atlanta. Was crazy. Another relationship. The school I used to teach at, Westminster. Bill Arnett's kid and all of that. The Arnett family was a Westminster family, which is really cool to have that. So I would walk around the school and see like Thornton Dial pieces scattered every so often. It was some in the library and stuff. So I would actually, when I was teaching my students, I would take them to the library and we would do like some analysis and stuff. And then I thought it was a thing about school pride. So anyway, Bill Arnett was the one that was traveling through Bessemer, Alabama, and made contact with Thornton Dial. I don't know the actual exact story, but I know he was the one that was like, wait a minute, this dude is on to something. So what Thornton Dial was talking about in his work were the circumstances in the economic times. He was talking about the social and economic injustices, right? So when you look at his work, Don't Matter How Raggedy the Flag, it's still got to tie us together. Like, if you look at that work was about America. It was about what was going on. If you look at it, it was cloth. It's, red, white. It's got all the American flag colors in it, but the way it was constructed, the rawness, the edges, all of that stuff, it really does show oppression, but it talks about work, right? It talks about, again, being tied together. Like, and I think nowadays we need to really ask ourselves, have we moved much past that work in and of itself? Like, have we moved past that painting, or are we still looking at it? I feel like we're still looking at it. So what Thornton Dow was communicating again was about chaos, environmental chaos. So he was talking about the hurricanes that would come through there, the tornadoes, right? And you got to think, man, like, we get tornadoes here in Atlanta, but they don't impact us like they do in Alabama, like that Tornado Alley and all of that stuff. But then you're talking about poverty on top of that. So you got people losing a lot of stuff. And he was talking about wreckage. He was talking about internal wreckage. He was talking about external wreckage. Um, you know, Thornton Dial was acutely and keenly aware of what was going on in front of him in the same way that Muddy Waters was doing, and communicating through his work. When we think about Can't Be Satisfied, Muddy Waters' song, that song, he was talking about going to Chicago and making that migration and still not finding the internal gratification that was promised, right? Blacks were still struggling in Chicago, because it then became saturated and trying to find their way through. Like, he was still talking about the economic circumstances of the time. So, he was still talking about what it felt to be a Black American at the time. And again, I think those two pieces kind of weave together. The next thing about both of them, they were self-taught creators. So neither one of them had a formal art education, in the sense of going to an art school or anything like that. No. When you think about Muddy Waters, he came off an acoustic guitar, and electric guitars and amplifiers were a new thing at the time. So there were no effects pedals. There were no, but what he was trying to do with a guitar slide, just a glass bottleneck slide, what he was trying to do was amplify the sound to be heard in the city of Chicago, because in Mississippi, there were smaller venues, and so you could kind of work off an acoustic guitar there. But in the city with the noise and stuff like that, he was getting lost. So of course, there are plenty of stories about him playing on a smaller, I think it was a Supro amp, but I can't remember, but a smaller amp out, in basement practices and club practices and club performances. And they would just crank the amp, just crank the whole thing up as loud as possible. And that's actually what gave them their sound. It was about being resourceful. There was no study in it. It was just crank the thing up. There were early Fender and Gibson guitars, Les Pauls, and Telecasters. And there was no method to the madness. There was no science or anything. It was kind of trial and error. And I thought that was just really cool. You just kind of learn by experience. There's a point Little Walter comes in and he starts playing a harmonica, but then amplifying a harmonica for the same effect. These guys were still taking this style of Mississippi and doing the call and response thing now with just a louder, a louder sound. And at the same time, both of them were influenced by the church and preaching in the style, that call and response style of Black America and in our churches. Thornton Dial, same thing. He worked in industry, like, with industrial parts, steel, and all of that. So he had a practical knowledge of materials, right? He had a practical knowledge of how to make things sit together. So when I would pick up Thornton Dial's works, when I was an installer and installing it, like, it was heavy. And I think that's why a lot of my work is very, very, very heavy. It was material. It was, he was stacking things on top of it, and it was solid though. You never felt like anything was going to come off, but he was using all kinds of materials, cement and things like that. There was, again, no method to the madness. It was what worked. It was, it was about inexpensive materials that created works that were raw, and very unvarnished in that way. The last thing when we talk about the work, there was an emphasis on movement, color, and feel, which I would equate to sound, right? So it wasn't about perfection and precision. It was about recreating and generating their own sound and their own look and their own feel. Again, the references that they were getting from when you talk about Muddy Waters, that he was taking, they were listening to the radio, they were listening to vinyls that were coming in, and trying to remember that stuff, because a lot of the times they didn't have record players, and if they did, they still didn't get certain things at the time. So having to learn off of individual instances instead, and trying to kind of remember that, go home, take it, and remember, like, that forces you to have to fill in areas that maybe you don't remember or don't quite make sense. And so by proxy, you make your own sound, you create your own feel. Thornton Dow was doing the same thing. When you look at the people and the very human images in his work, again, anatomy wasn't necessarily considered. It was about what it looked like in things from his vantage point. He made you feel in the non-representational works from him, it was about the material and the object that told the story of what was going on. In a lot of ways, he is the most non-literal artist that I have ever come across. And anybody that knows me, I drill the literal thing a lot. But I believe he took things that were what was seemingly way out of context and making them make so much more sense together on the same plane. So, at the same time, like, they both shared a spirit of voicing their thoughts about the South, really about the country, but mostly about the South, and the oppression. And I think we need to look back at their works and consider the times now. We as artists are experiencing, again, a loss of voices, censorship and things like that. And I just see a lot of that relating to the times of those artists. And I think as they document the story, then they felt compelled to do so. I don't know if they took it as a responsibility per se, but I know there was a compulsion to do that. I think now there's a real deal responsibility because we have the access to materials and the access to the information and the knowledge to be able to create works about the time. So with that being said, think about work that tell the stories about resilience and survival. They tell the stories about pride, personal pride in what you do, whatever that means to you, and the attempts at erasure, right? And how we make works that really are timeless. And I think both of these artists are very timeless in their presentation. With that being said, that is the end of another episode. Make sure you guys go support the brand, buy the coffee. Tune in with us next time. I like talking about art history, and it helps me better understand the guitar work that I'm learning, and the styles and so on and so forth, and finding that relative balance, and all of that. So with that being said, join us on October 8th through the 11th at Norton and Hodges in Charleston, South Carolina for American Soul, American Soul 3. And that's all, folks.
You said 3P, year 3?
It is year 3. All right.
Well, I went back to be back home. I'm gonna go down south, child. The woman I'm trouble. I be a hard wood. can't be satisfied. And I just can't keep from crying. Well, I feel like snapping. Give me your pen.